Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today in beautiful Southern California, but broadcasting all the way to the Douro region of the Portugal, having a conversation with Carla Tiago of the Kopke Port House. Introductions in just a second. Wine Talks available, of course, on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you hang out for your podcasting, and sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club. Have a listen coming up. We have some incredible stories from around the world. I had a conversation with a Greek influencer, a London-based influencer, and Frederica from the UK Somm Association. All those are out on Wine Talks with Paul K. Have a listen. But not why we're here today, because we have Carla Tiago from the Kopke Port House. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So nice
Thank
to
you
have
for
you.
the invitation.
It's in the afternoon out there in Portugal. We're just starting with coffee this morning here in Southern California. So I kind of envy you because you're probably about to venture into some port and shut down the day.
Yes, we will for sure. Because this is will be the last day of the harvesting. So we'll have this big dinner with all the people that were involved, and we'll have port for sure.
Well, we're going to talk about port, how it's made, what's in it, the sort of the terroir of what's going on and where you're at. But I'm glad you just brought up the harvest. It's October what 5th or 7th.
Yeah.
So it's the last day of harvest. Is this? Let's just go right into it. Is this an early harvest, a later harvest, or just typical harvest?
It was an early harvest, so this was quite a dry and hot year, and we start the harvest in the end of September. Normally we start at that time in the last week of September, but this year because especially during the summer it was quite hot. We have to pick all the grapes the fastest possible. So we are going to end the harvest a little bit sooner than the normal. So normally we would have like one more week. This year we are finishing it.
So are you attributing this to? I got to turn my phone off here. Hold on, there you go. Are you attributing this to climate change? Is that, or is this? I mean, in
Yeah.
general, has the harvest shifted earlier into the summer, or is this is rare, or it's a little bit early for the normal?
Well, the climate change for sure. I can tell you that my first harvest was in 2005, and normally we would start the harvest in five between 5 and 10 of September. Right now we are starting in the end of August, so like 2 weeks
Wow,
before.
wow.
And especially in the last 5 years, all the years have been very different one from each other. So right now it's quite typical to say this was an atypical year. In the last five, all of them were quite different. And this one was very dry. I don't remember a year like this. Very dry and very
Wow.
hot. So during July, we had the medium of temperatures were around 38 Celsius. So it's very hot.
It was
Not so
76.
common.
Wow, that is hot.
Very hot.
I do my quick
Very hot indeed.
calculation. 38 times 2 is 76 plus 28. That's like 100 degrees almost.
Yeah.
So, I was looking on their website this morning, just pounding around the beautiful website, and I saw some pictures of some manual labor carrying the harvest. Is that what happens today? Because it's such a steep environment.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Most all the grapes are hand picked in all our states, and most of the work during the year it's made by people. It's in some of the places it's impossible to use machinery, so this is something really made by people always.
It's so funny. I mean, not funny. It's interesting because if you went back to the early days of wine all over the world, it was always manual, correct? And now, with the organic movement, the biodynamic movement, this is sort of they think this is sometimes what's new is old, what's old is new again, and now people are saying, well, we hand harvest, but you've been hand harvesting all this time. But let's go back. We kind of jumped ahead to the harvest, but I wanted to
Yeah.
talk about the history of Kapka because it's the oldest port house in existence from the early days of port making. Is that accurate?
Yes, so it was established in 1638
Wow.
by Mr. Kopke. He was like a diplomat, a German diplomat that came to Portugal and start a business. In the beginning, he was in the trade market with different things, not only wine. And then with time, it was his main business. So in 1750, he bought his first state, his first quinta. So and after that, basically, all the wines have been carrying a unique character that we try to keep
So we
and
want to,
take care of.
going back to that time, 1638, and first of all, having a business that is still around after 700 years or 600 years is actually fascinating. I mean, I'm sorry, 400 years.
Yeah.
But we weren't making port at that point, right? We were making still red and white wines.
Yes. At that time, it was still wines. So, and we don't really know when things completely change.
Really?
When
Okay. That's the
the
next question.
spirits, yes, it's something. It's still a mystery.
Yeah.
So we know that until the beginning of the, I know that in most of the people say, or there is a story about it, and probably it's the most reliable one, is that in 1820, it was a very, very hot year. And so all grapes didn't fermentate until the end. In this final wine had plenty of sugar, still plenty of sugars, plenty of alcohol. And when we shipped the wines to England and other places in all over the world, we were adding spirit so the wine don't spoil during the trip. So that wine in the final wine would have more alcohol and more sugar than usual, and people really like it. So it's like a very, very special year, and we know that after that it's when we start to put spirit to stop the fermentation, but we don't really know when and how or which company started it. So in the beginning, basically, we were making still wines and selling all over the world. The region was demarcated in 1755, demarcated and regulated. So it was the first one to have rules. So where you could produce grapes to produce the best wines, who could buy them and sell them. So plenty of rules was established at that time. And since that time, the region have been suffering different regulations. The truth is that nowadays, port wine is perhaps one of the most controlled products in the world. So we have an institute that controls since the plantation of the grapes, which grapes we have, how many we have, the hectares that we have, and they control since the plantation until the bottling and the selling. So they know exactly the amount of wine that we have, for which profiles of wine that we have. So it's something that is very well. They are very present in all the process.
Well, we're gonna peel that back a little bit, which is a problem because I just heard from my friends last night. We were talking, and they listened to the show, and they said, "Well, every time you say peel that back, we know that we're getting into something." So I'm sorry, I keep using the same term, but let's just go back a little. I want to go back a little further because you said some important things, and part of the reason, as I understand from my studies of this, the English were, I can't remember if it was a war or they were angry or with the French and other parts of Europe, and so they turned to Portugal for their wines, and then we couldn't make the trip across the channel. It just was not, the wines weren't surviving. As you said, there was, at that point, there was some sugar in it, and maybe that just, even though sugar is a preservative of sorts, that it wasn't working, so we added distilled spirits to help
Yes.
preserve the wine, which is that says a whole lot. And I want to peel it back. I was thinking about it this morning. For one, you mentioned one thing that at that time you added after the wine was fermented and there was some residual sugar. In those days, you added the distilled spirits just as a preservative so it could make the trip across to England. And of course, the profile of these wines became so exciting that it became a whole industry in itself. But now we
Yeah.
don't do that. Now we actually use the distilled spirit to stop the fermentation, and that has some residual sugar and elevates the alcohol. So that's two different sort of processes at that time.
Yes. So in the beginning, basically in the beginning, alcohol was only used to preserve the wine. So and it was like 3% of the amount of
Mm-hmm.
wine that you were producing. Okay. So when you start to put the barrels in the boat, you'll put like 3% of spirit, and they had a better performance during the trip. In nowadays, and one of it's how we do port wine. So at some point of the fermentation, depending what the quantity of sugar that you want in your wine, you are going to put the spirit. You are going to basically to kill the yeasts, and you'll have like a sweet, a natural sweet wine with 20% of alcohol. Most of them, it's the percentage of alcohol that they have.
It's interesting. I wonder what that is. Does anybody in Portugal today make it the old way, and they add spirits to already fermented and finished wine, just to see what it would
Uh,
what the difference in balance would be like?
it's not allowed.
Oh, so that settles that.
You can make like a still wine or a port wine. You can't add a spirit after the, or you can't call it like it's not a DOC wine.
Oh, I
Okay,
see. Okay,
so
so the
so
process is
basically,
controlled.
and when we were putting like adding the spirit, normally they were quite dry wines. Okay, at that point, the wines were quite dry. They put the spirit only to be sure that the wine would arrive at the destination in good shape. But and then when we start to see how it changed, why we start to have sweeter wines. Well, one of the stories that is perhaps most reliable is that one that I told, but there are plenty of them. So it's like a mystery.
Mm.
Nobody really
Hmm.
knows how that happened.
Well, it's exciting. For me, the historical value of that is amazing because here's this now this well respected and complicated and complex drink or beverage from Portugal that originally started just as just a need to get
Yeah.
alcohol to England, which seems to be the movement of the day. I mean, Champagne was in the same situation, right? They were shipping to England and Russia, and now we were become huge markets. But I was just thinking about this. You have this residual sugar in port, and so we're going to go through some of the different styles of port that are made and that you make. But I was thinking through when you said there was drier versions, and there's certainly dry white ports. But there's
Yeah.
also when you talk about Madeira and sherry, you have this very very dry, and I think for me hard to drink, Fino sherries as opposed to the cream sherries. But almost all red port is got some residual sugar, correct?
Yes, yes. Even the dry ones have a percentage of sugar, like 40 grams of sugar for sure. So it's always sweet, but it's drier. They
There's some
are
different,
drier than the common
right?
ones. Basically, it's that because a standard one will have like 100 grams of sugar per liter.
Wow.
So that's the standard one. And then we'll have some of them with less sugar, and you have a dry part with like 30, 40 grams of sugar.
And that's per
So it's
liter,
different from the Madeira wines or the sherry.
right? So
So
at Kopke, see, I'm used to saying Kopke at Kopke, and the reason I brought up this video that I shot a few years ago with your importer at the time is every single year that when come the holidays, I try I hate to say it this way, but I try to find something better. Just as my job, as my role to my clients and my members is like, can I find a port for the holidays that I think has better value than Kopke? And it's never happened. And this is probably 10 years running now that I set out about now. I bring all the vendors bring their ports in, we taste through them, and I still have not been able to find, as a compliment, even though it's sort of a challenge, a port of all from Tawny Ruby to Vintage to Coletta that represents better value than your wines.
For me,
Yes.
of course not. Well,
It's like,
I'm sorry. The truth is that, well, it's amazing, especially when you talk about old townies. It's something that, well, Kopke has this huge library of different wines, different collectors from the different years, and it's quite amazing because we keep all these wines in barrels, so they are every year they are aging a little bit more. So
Mm-hmm.
every time that we taste them, even if we don't notice big difference, the truth is that it's always a different wine.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Kopke really has this really diverse amount of wines that are luxurious. So I can tell that, of course, I've already tried different ports,
Mm-hmm.
and some of them very, very good. But perhaps it's, of course, it's this emotional part of me that I work here for so long. It's impossible to say that Kopke is not the best one. I'm sorry.
Well, and I'm going to just make that a little more granular and say it's like the best value, because there can be some very expensive ports, and I don't see the reason that they have to be so expensive when there's value, such as the Kopke ports. But before we get into the styles of port that you make, this one question is coming just from me, because at some point, with the English interest in port wine, and this is clearly after 1750 or in the 1700s, there's investment interest in port wines from the English. So you have the Grahams and you have the Taylors, and then you have the indigenous Kopkes. So what's the history of that? That the English decide, okay, I think this is so great that we're going to invest in it. And are these still English owned? Are these English owned port houses? So let's put it this way: are these indigenous Portuguese houses versus the English houses? Are we all sort of all in this together?
Yes, the truth is that all of us have different profiles. Of course, if you when you think in English houses, you normally think in vintage ports like Douro style.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, you can find like beautiful townies from Grams or Fonseca, or all of them have beautiful townies also. But the quantities and the amounts of these kind of wines are lesser than in Kopke. So basically, we have like the English house is very associated to the ruby style, and the Portuguese house is more associated to the tawny style.
Mm-hmm.
And this also reflects a little bit the way of our cultures, like English much more pragmatic, Portuguese much more poetic, and
Mm-hmm.
like you put a wine in the barrel, you wait a little bit, and then say, oh, just wait a little bit, and then when you see a century has passed away,
Wow.
okay? So and in Kopke you see that. So the huge amount of wines that you have, and so diverse from the whites and reds. So it's quite amazing.
My father and I opened when all the computers were supposed to crash in the year 2000, when we crossed over and the whole thing was going to fall apart. My dad and I decided we would just wait it out by opening a bottle of 1900, and I can't remember the brand. I have the bottle here somewhere. It's either Quinta Novel or Nacional. I can't remember. But we opened a bottle of 1900 port, so it was 100 years old, which he purchased on a trip to Portugal many years earlier. And reluctantly, the owner of the port house sold it to him, and he brought it back and it sat on our shelf for many years, and it was fabulous. And it was I'd say in the glass it was good for about 15 minutes. So those first sips, and we all know oxidation happens very rapidly in a very old wine, whether it's port or still wine, but it was there's something romantic about it. There's something historical about it. There's something just unique about it to have a wine that represented 100 years earlier. And that was a fascinating experiment for us. So let's go through the styles of port that we're talking about. You mentioned ruby port, which I think is sort of an entry-level version of port. Uh, Kopke makes ruby port. We sell a lot of it here.
Yeah.
What's in that port, and what's the style that you look for when you're trying to make that port?
So ruby is also a style, okay? And when we talk about the ruby style, we're talking about the standard one, the reserve, the LBV, and the vintage. So this is we call a ruby style, and that means that what we want to show in these wines is basically the fruitiness.
Mm-hmm.
And normally they are like dark ruby wines with plenty of blackberries, great acidity. They are like splendorous. And when you smell it, you normally notice many different things that you know for sure. Your nose goes to the strawberries, to all that things, the chocolate. Well, you have the ruby, it's the standard one, the more common one, and then you have the vintage. And the vintage, it's like the best of the best that you can do in a harvest. Okay, so it's a single year wine that we keep for 2 years in our cellars, and then we send a sample to the institute. They taste it, and they say, well, you can bottle it as a vintage. So second year after the harvest, you have to bottle it, and all the aging is going to be in the bottle. Okay, so we are not going to filtrate this wine, and this wine have to have all the potential to age in the bottle. So great acidity, good tannins, plenty of flavor, a very deep, dark, it's like the representative of the year. And normally it's only done in the best years.
So the
So
vintage.
after that, we have the LBV. And the LBV, it's like, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I just fascinated because I want to just stop for a second because the concept of vintage port for the listener, you have ruby ports, which is a representation of that year, of course. But when the institute says, okay, now we can call it a 2000, whatever the last 2017 was the last declared vintage, right? Is there a rule amongst the institute that so many houses have to produce a reputable vintage that year in order for you to declare the vintage, or how do you declare your vintage?
No, you can declare it by your own. Basically, when you have like a very, very good wine that you think, well, we should bottle this one as a vintage because it's very, very good. We send a sample to the institute, and they say, well, they taste it, blind tasting always, and they say, well, this is a vintage, you can bottle it. And it can be only Kopke to do it. Or if you have most of the companies doing it and achieving it, you can do, well, it's not the institute that declare as a classic year. It's a classic year because most of the companies could achieve a vintage.
I see. Okay.
So that's normally people say, well, when it's more than 50% of the houses that declare as a vintage, it's a classic vintage. I'm not sure if it's a percentage, but it's something that's not the institute that does, okay? It's like, it's the year that it's declared because most of the houses really get a very good wine that can be bottled as a vintage.
So are those designated on the label differently than let's say less than 50%? Let's just pick that number. If many houses make a very nice vintage ruby that year, but many don't, is it labeled differently on the bottle? I mean, if I say 2017, I know that's like a lot of people had 2017s, but if you bottled a 2016 because you had an extraordinary vintage, is it labeled the same way?
It can be labeled the same way, or you can ask to put the name of the state. And normally when the grapes came only from one single state, some companies prefer to put like and we have some that is Kopke São Luís vintage, Quinta de São Luís vintage. That is our state.
I see. Okay.
For Kopke. But you can choose only to put the Kopke vintage if you want to. So it's but when you put the name of the state, that means all the grapes came from that state.
Interesting.
And there are some things that it's strange in port vintage, and I think things are changing too. But normally it was associated that if it was a single Quinta vintage, that would not be so good as a classic one. But it's we know that in most of the wine business, in the wine working, you know that when you put the name of the state, it's something much more unique, you know. But in port wine was not, things were not being made like that. Right now, I think, especially the companies and even the consumer, really like to know where the grapes come from. Of course, a port wine, it's always a mixture of different kinds of grapes that came from different places. So when you think in Douro Valley, we can talk about like 45,000 hectares of vineyards.
Wow.
And I can tell you that I think the last year was published that we have about 33,000 farmers.
Wow.
So that means that the medium
amazing.
is like 1 hectare for each viticulture.
That's
so,
amazing.
Yeah. So what we have to do, of course, we have our states. We work very well what we have in our states, but we have plenty of farmers that work for generations.
Yes.
For growing grapes to these brands, and they are very important to us.
You know, these are, what is that? These are important stories to tell because my job with this podcast and with my company is to bring to light for the consumer the idea behind what a real glass of wine is and a real glass of port and what it means to you. It's not, and so the more granular we get with estates, with which property, you know, with the terroir, the more stories we can tell about what's in the bottle, and start to elevate people's appreciation for what's in the glass when they're experiencing a good glass of wine. And that's a challenge for all of us to do because business gets in the way, right? When you go to the market, and I'm not sure, but I've never been to a supermarket in Portugal, but the stuff you see here in Los Angeles or anywhere in the United States, you know, it doesn't represent the finer things in the wine world. And I want people to appreciate that and understand that. In fact, tonight, my son-in-law and my daughter are in from New York for a couple of weeks with the kids, and he's a wine enthusiast, and I'm taking home some single vineyard Malbecs from Argentina to taste. And we'll be taking support, you know, throughout the 2 weeks too. Don't worry about that. But I want him to taste these different elevations of terroir for the same house, same winemaker, same barrels, same everything except for the terroir. So I think this idea behind the estate bottling of port is an important one to convey to the consumer. So if you have a ruby port, which sounds like to me is its aging is in the bottle. You don't get the oxygen circulating through the wine in barrel. Its value in the port world is that it ages in the bottle, and this is what we're looking at. And this is obviously what I tasted when I tasted the 1900. That wine had not gone through a ton of barrel aging. So we move into tawny ports, which then is the opposite of that, right? They're aged in the barrel and bottled later.
Frank, but only one single thing. Even in ruby style, the one that really have potential of aging in the bottle is the vintage. So when we talk about a standard ruby or a reserve ruby, even an LBV, these are wines that when we put them in the bottle, they are perfect to drink right now. You can, of course, you can keep it. It's not going to be damaged, but they are perfect to drink. In a vintage, of course, you can drink it right now, and there are plenty of people that really are fond of all this fruitiness, all this richness that you have when they are young. But the truth is that if you wait some years, good years, you can even have a barren, more complex one. Okay. In the tawny style, it's like you said, it's the opposite. So in this one, we are going to have like this very, very, very slow oxidation of different kinds of wines in small barrels. When I talk in small barrels, like 600 liters barrels, and we are going to put them there for a long, long time. When I say like we have some old collators that are there since the harvest, like the 34, 35,
Wow.
37, or
Wow.
38. These are perhaps, well, we have older than that ones, but these ones we have to sell small amounts of it, of course. But all of these wines have been all this period in these barrels. So, and we only bottle them by demand of the client. So every single bottling is going to be quite unique wine also. Even if you don't notice, in a year, if you make two different bottlings of the same old curator, the truth is that they are different.
So you have
They've been
what blends does Kopke make? Do they have a 10-year, 20-year? What the different designations for the average age of the wine in the bottle?
okay. So we have a 10, 20, 30, 40,
Wow.
and right now a 50 years old. That it's a new thing. In whites and tawnies, so whites and reds. And then we have the curators. What is the difference? Well, in a 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years old, we have a blend of different wines that are aging in barrels for this kind of profile. And every time that we make a new blend, and normally it's in the beginning of the year, have to make a new blend of 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years old, we have to make sure that it's very, very similar to the last one. So our clients, every time they bought a 10, 20, 30, or 40 years old, or even 50, when they are buying these bottles, they are sure that they know what kind of wine is in the bottle, okay? And if we work well, the truth is that they are not going to notice difference between them. So we hope that the wine that we are tasting today, like at 10 years old, is going to be very similar to the one that you will taste in 10 years, okay? This is one of the most challenging things in our job, and more exciting too, because every time that you have to make these wines, you have to taste what we have in our cellars that is aging for this, okay? Because every year the blend is going to be quite different, and we have to make sure that it's very similar, okay? The Colheita, it's a single year wine, and that means that we do the harvest, and the wines stay in Douro Valley until the beginning of the spring, and then we start to move them to Vila Nova de Gaia, so near Porto, and we put them in barrels, and they stay there and will stay there for a long time. So we can only start bottling it legally 7 years after the harvest, but in Kopke, we only start to bottle it 10 years after the harvest. So this year we are releasing 2012 Colheita. And we are only going to bottle a small amount. All the rest will remain in the barrel. So that means that this is a wine that it's always changing. So every time that we buy a Colheita, and you can see the year of the bottling in the back label of the bottle, every year this one is going to change. So every time that you are buying a Colheita, it's going to be a different one, and you never know if it will be if you'll have the same impression of the wine that you had last time that you tasted. Okay, so it's always a different thing. So in the 10, 20, 30, and 40 years old, our job is to maintain the style and make sure that wine is very similar. In this one, it's always a surprise. That's what makes this wine so amazing.
That's I'm going to use the word again that I'm people say I use too much, but that's fascinating. So if I'm a consumer and I'm looking at a Coletta, that's a vintage version of tawny, aged in
Yeah,
barrel, and deliberately and expressively is going to represent a time for that
yeah,
port house and a place, of course, where it's being grown, as opposed to the 10, 20, 30, and 40 and 50, which I think I read a press release that you came out with the 50, which is amazing, is really a representation of what the style this port house is trying to convey to its consumers, and that every year we try to repeat. It's kind of like whiskey or vodka, where the distiller's job is to make sure that it has similar profile from year to year to year, bottling to bottling, so that the consumer who says I like Kopke 10-year, 20, whatever it is, every time I get it, I'm pretty certain this is what I'm getting.
yeah.
So this 50-year thing is amazing. And I saw on your website you have a 50-year-old white port, and I want to talk about white port in a second, but are you blending red ports as well in the 50-year average?
Yes. So one of the things that and perhaps that was the reason why the institute um, came with the 50 years old, is that most of the companies have plenty of different wines, quite old. They don't have the year of the harvest, or because they already are a blend of different
Mm-hmm.
years,
Mm-hmm.
and it was not fair to if you want to bottle it, you had to bottle it as a 40 years old. And when you have like older wines, well, you want to show that it's older than 40. Okay, so for the 50, basically, we have these. Uh, great wines that we could that we can work with, and you have to taste it, Frank, because it's quite amazing. Well, the tone is absolutely marvelous, but the white, it's something completely different from most of the things that probably you already had tasting. Even for people that know all the white ports, and Kopke perhaps is one of the companies that has more different ones.
Mm-hmm.
This 50, it's like really fresh with different kinds of flavors.
That's amazing.
And every time that you drink it, something more come over. It's an endless wine. It's
That's
absolutely
amazing.
amazing.
I have to find some. It's been
Yes,
hard
you
to find.
have.
It's been hard to get in Los Angeles. There's been. I'm just going to say this. I wrote an email this morning to your people, but there was a disruption in the availability of Kopke ports in Los Angeles a couple of years ago. I ended up buying them on like different websites to get it for my clients, but I think it's stabilized now, and I'm hoping that we can have a regular access to the brand because it is the
Yes,
preferred port
things.
here.
I think right now things are much better, and
Okay,
I
good.
think with time will be even better. We are quite optimistic about that.
So tell me about this 50-year-old white port, because white port's sort of an anomaly. People don't understand it. We don't see a lot of it. I actually use white port to put in a martini as opposed to a vermouth, but it's really we should enjoy it as an aperitif and after dinner. But tell me about what are the grapes in white port and how is it processed differently than a red port?
Okay, so in white ports, especially if you you have different kinds of white ports. So you have the standard white ports that with different profiles, and the biggest difference is the quantity of sugar that you have in them. So you have the dry ports, you have the fine white that has around 100 grams of sugar, and then you have another one that it's called lagrima. It means tear because it's
Mm-hmm.
quite sweet. It has more than 135 grams of sugar.
Wow.
Okay, so these are quite different. The sweetness is going to be different. Even the flavors are going to be different because of the sweetness, of course. So the driest one will be more like for tropical fruits. In the white, we'll have like some hints of honey, and in the lagrima, the honey is going to be more present in the nose, even in the mouth. Some apricot. So they are quite different, and for different occasions, I can tell you. And then we also have these wines that are aged in barrel. So we have the 10, 20, 30, and 40, and the 50, and
Wow.
we have collators.
Wow.
Okay.
Really? Collectors too.
I can tell that we have a dry collator from 1935.
Wow.
That it's an amazing wine, and because it's dry, it doesn't have all that flavors that we are expecting in an old port. So normally we'll go for like all these quantities of dry fruits, and but because it's not so sweet and it's quite dry, we are going to have like more delicate and elegant flavors, very very well integrated. So it's an amazing wine. But in the collators, since 2002, we've been doing also every year we've been making different wines to age in a barrel. So normally for these wines, we are going to vinify them as a red port.
Mm-hmm.
So with all the peels,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
put it together. So of course, in ports, it's very important the quantity of sugar, but also the acidity. So this balance between sugar and acidity, it's going to be very important in the balance of wine, the
Mm-hmm.
final wine. So if we have a good quantity of sugar, it means that we can fermentate the wine for a longer time, because we know that at middle of the fermentation we are going to put the spirits. So if
Mm-hmm.
we have a good quantity of sugar, it means that we have more days to extract everything that we want in a pot, for a red or for a white. Okay, so these ones that fermentate with all the peels and everything, we normally select these ones to put in barrels and to age. Of course, the grapes that we use, well, in Douro Valley, we have more than 100 different grapes for
Wow.
whites and reds. Okay, so here everything it's a blend, and it's the beginning of everything. It's a blend. Okay, most of the old vineyards are blend fields, so that means that you have many different grapes there. Most of the times you don't know even the percentage of each one that you
So they're
have,
field blends.
and so
Wow.
this is start like a big mystery in the
Yeah.
beginning with a big blend, and then uh, and after that you
That's
have
amazing.
yeah. So it's quite difficult. You can't do like a single grape port wine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Doesn't
this is
exist.
the beginning of the thing. So
Yeah.
everything it's a blend, and then you put it in different barrels that are a blend of different woods. That most of them you don't really know from where they came, because they are very very old. Some of them with more than 50 and 60 years old,
Wow.
that are very well taken care of by people that work with us. And then you have many different persons that work in these
Mm-hmm.
wines. When you think that we have wines that were made in 34, 35, 37, and we think the amount of people that work with these wines, it's quite amazing. So in the end, basically diversity is what makes this wine so unique.
So interesting. I did not know that these were basically field blends, which is to the listener means that whatever's in the field when they pick it, that's if they're fermented together, whether it's Touriga Nacional or Sauzal or whatever grapes are out there. They're just picked and harvested and fermented together, and we don't know exactly the percentages.
Yes.
In the early days of wine in California, particularly in my dad's shop in 1969 to 1985, Americans were making port. The one, probably the most famous one was Paul Masson, and they used to bottle it as Sauzal, so it was 100% Sauzal. And I'm trying to dig a little deeper in that. I'd like to explore it a little more because they don't obviously have the history that the port has, the history of Portugal in the Douro River, but also America at that time, even with its still wines, would bottle things 100%, and they were so proud of putting on the label 100% Cabernet or 100% Pinot Noir, and that was because we didn't know the value of a blend. We didn't know that the sum is the sum is the wow. I just lost the whole thought. The sum is greater than the the parts are greater. The sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I got it
So
now.
fast,
A little
yeah.
early. Um, And so I'm going to go back and find this out because I featured many ports from California in the early days of this business, and now I want to see if those things were bottled 100% because we thought that was the right thing to do, or is that we didn't know any better. But how important is the value of the distilled spirit that you're using to arrest fermentation? In other words, where does the spirit come from, and how important is the quality of that spirit to the port profile?
So it's very, very important. The spirit that we use, it has 77% of alcohol. Okay,
Wow.
it's the law.
Wow.
Okay, it's the law. It has to have 77% of alcohol. And when you start to choose, of course, you have to taste plenty of them. So distilleries send you samples to taste and to decide which one you are going to buy. But the truth is that you can only buy it or you can only use it if the institute approve it.
Oh,
So
okay.
we have to send a sample to them. They have to taste it. They have they taste it. They do all the chemical analysis, and only after that you can use it. Okay. So normally, what we do, we only buy spirits that have already been approved by the institute. And what we are looking for in this kind of spirits, well, basically we want a very neutral one, the one that's not going to put anything in your wine. Basically, it's going to increase your alcohol in a way that it's going to be quite balanced. So that's always what we are trying to look for. And the spirit can be from wine or from other sub-product of wine processing, okay?
So
Normally
it's
the best
brand
ones are from wine.
is it brandy, or can it be neutral grain spirits like vodka?
Yeah.
Anything.
The only grape, yes, very neutral, always. But it's from wine, vinic spirit.
Oh, it's from grapes.
Spirit. Yes, from grapes.
Okay.
From grapes or from wine. You can still
Oh, from
wine.
wines, right? So I want for the listeners, I want them to understand this because I've made my own brandy before, and it wasn't very good. And so when you say it's 70%, 77% alcohol, that means
You
23%.
did?
Yes,
You did? Okay.
yes. And I have a client who comes by here and picks up, oddball wines and distills it at home. And the other day he picked up a pallet, literally a pallet of wine. It was a misdirected pallet to us. The supplier didn't want it anymore. He said just get rid of it, and it was completely oxidized Spanish Rioja. And so he
Okay.
he distilled this. And the reason I brought it up is for the listeners, it's important what you start with because his resulting distilled, which was almost 100% alcohol at that point, was horrible. Because no matter how much you boil it off and filter it out, what the influence of what it starts with is still there. And,
Yeah.
and so it's why some vodkas taste different than others, even though they're all supposed
Yeah.
to be neutral grain. And so I think it's this 23% of that's not alcohol that's in a distilled spirit that you're putting to arrest the fermentation of the port is an important feature. And I just wanted to clarify that. So this is already going almost on an hour, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. But I do want to sort of approach this idea of the cultural expression of port because I was fortunate. My father was raised in Cairo, and so that was an English protectorate. So the idea of port or cognac, proper service is just the English way. And we've established early in this conversation that the English were part of the promotion of port in the first place. Around the world, where do you see that this is understood? In other words, the English understand that we end the evening with a glass of port and some blue cheese or some almonds or whatever else you serve with it, but as a cultural expression of I don't want to say sort of the aristocracy of the world, but it does have the perception of being a cultural event to have a glass of port at the end of the day.
Well, I can tell you, there are two stories that I could share with you. Like the first time I went to England for a decanter fair of Portuguese and Spanish wines, we went there with Kopke only with old ports, and this was I'm not sure, but perhaps 2014, perhaps 15.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, perhaps 14. And most of I can tell you that more than 90% of the persons that went there and taste these Kopke wines uh, were looking at me when I put a little bit in the glass. They were looking at me and said, "This is not port." Okay, so they didn't recognize a tawny port as a port
Right, because of
because
the
most
color.
of them were used to drink ruby style.
Mm-hmm.
And this was quite strange for me. It's like quite an impact.
Mm.
Well, most of the people don't know these wines, and when they were tasting them, they were quite amazed because these were like different kinds of flavors that they were not used to. So normally these wines are much more spicy. We'll find all these dry figs, dry fruitiness, some typical leaves. So they are completely different from
Mm-hmm.
the ruby style. And then right now things are changing. Right now, UK it's like a good market for tawny style. And my first time in Denmark, it was like
Wow.
in 15 perhaps, and they have a fair only for port wine. So they have the
Really?
date, it's in November, and the only wines that people are getting there, it's port wine. And I was quite amazed because most of the people were coming to me and asked for a specific data that they already know. They've tasted for most some years, and they come to me and say, "Well, I want to try the 78 because last year I think it was like this and this and this and this." And Jesus, most of them have these they are quite an expertise in port
Mm-hmm.
wines, not only
Mm-hmm.
in tawny style but also in vintage ports. So I perhaps think that this is perhaps is the most mature market for port wine. Even in Portugal, most of the people don't. I used to drink these old ports, you know. So in
That's
Denmark, it
interesting.
was like quite an experience, and every year we receive a bunch of people that come and visit us, and they really know what they want to taste. They really know our port, so it's quite an amazing experience even for us. It's like it's great to talk with people that really know these wines and understand them and enjoy them
That's
a lot.
interesting
So
because I pour them at home. Usually, when there's a crowd, like I said this week, we're going to taste some together with my family. But almost invariably, almost 100% of the people ask, "What is this?" Before I show
yeah,
them the bottle, and then they see the bottle and they see this, the stencil, and they go, "Oh yeah," they recognize the old style of bottling that you guys do still with the stencil on there, and it's interesting for me after all these years of doing this. This is my 32nd year that there's still just so many people in the wine world that are being acquainted with port for the first time, and I'm
yeah,
happy to be part of that. And just for the listeners, what Carla's talking about is that when you pour a glass of ruby port, it's rather viscous and it's dark and it's inky and there's tons of color and extraction. But when you pour a tawny, and it seems as the average age 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, it's more translucent, it's browner, it's clearer, but it's deceiving because there's so much complexity in those aged tawnies that were aged in barrel that you look at the glass and you go, it's kind of weird, and then all of a sudden you taste it and you go, wow, there's a lot going on in here. So it's a fascinating part of the wine world that I think is important to share. And that's why I was wondering because there are cultures that are not, I'm not going to say behind, but that are experiencing things that many cultures have experienced for years. I mean, obviously Europe and Portugal, Spain, port has
yeah,
been around forever, but let's just take the Chinese market. They're just coming out of the idea that we have to have Bordeaux and Opus One to order and enjoy wine, and they're finding other things. But the
yeah.
Japanese figured that out a long time ago. So,
It's true.
yeah, it's just sort of the bell curve of when people learn. How are the Asian markets for after dinner drinks and wine?
Well, I can tell that right now, South Korea, it's a great market for port wine.
Wow, that's interesting.
And it has been increasing in the last years. And right now, it's a very good client. Well, in China, it's always very unpredictable. There are some years that you really sell good amounts of port and good ones, and others that we don't understand very well why. The truth is that it's a sweet wine, so normally it's very well accepted, even if people don't are used to drink wine. So ports, it's quite easy to drink it at the first time, especially if you like sweet things. And then when you go for the older ones, the sweetness, it's not so evident. It's not so obvious because you have the acidity. The acidity normally gives you like this good balance between them, gives you the freshness that is required to drink this kind of wines. But well, in China, things are always unpredictable for us. Right now, we don't have like established that it's growing or if it's decreasing, because the truth is that there are some years that it has a good it's been good, others it's not so good, and we don't understand very well why.
Yeah, well, there are. I mean, wine in China it's unpredictable because the regime changes and there's all kinds of political reasons why wine comes and goes.
Probably.
I mean, it's kind of interesting for me that the French have been taking up vineyards in China trying to make wines, and I think it took Lafite Rothschild, I don't know, 10 vintages before they actually released it because they just couldn't figure it out. And I'm waiting to get a bottle of this wine because it's $500 a bottle.
Jesus, I didn't know that.
I mean, can you imagine?
Well, I can tell one of the things that happen. I'm a jury in the Berlin Wine Trophy since 2015, and like I'm not sure if it was in 19. We had this flight only. At the time that we were tasting, we didn't know, of course, with Chardonnay, and they were quite good, very good indeed. And in the end, we could see where they came from, and all of them came from China.
Really?
And they were quite
wow,
good.
That's fascinating. That'd be
we
fun.
didn't know the prices, of course, but everybody was quite impressed and surprised
So
with the quality, and they were coming from China. So
wow, that's kind of
it
a
was going
fun.
to
That's
happen.
kind of a
I
fun
think they
deal.
are not going to do port wines. I hope.
No, we hope they don't. They can't call them port anyway, right? I mean, we have to establish that.
It's true.
It's been a fascinating opportunity to chat with you. Now we have so much more to talk about, but we're going to run out of time here. And I want to express our thanks for coming on the show, and we hope to see you one day in Port. And if you're, of course, Portugal, if you're ever here in Los Angeles, love to entertain you for a glass of whatever you want to pour that day.
I'd love to.
There's always
and
something
I hope
open.
that you come and visit us.
It's
I
on
think
the
you are
docket.
going to like it.
It's an
amazing country, and Porto and Douro Valley are completely amazing. So please come and visit us.
We look forward to that. If you don't mind, you can, when we're done with this, send us the file that we just had there recording. We'll be using that for the sound, but we'll be sending you the links, and we look forward to having another conversation as we get past the holidays. Maybe first quarter next year, we'll reconvene and talk some more.
It will be lovely. I'd love to.
Thank you very much for the time
today.
Thank
you, Frank. Thank you so much.
Evening. Take
Have
care.
a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye. Print it.
Recording stopped.